Good day everyone, I'm Aileen Amazon and we are Group 5. The topic we discuss today is about cognitive condition of learning. And these are the categories of learning: verbal information, intellectual skills, cognitive strategies, attitudes, motor skills. Cognitive condition of learning theory. Robert Cogne's seminal work in his condition of learning outcomes and the 9 events of instruction. Together, these two themes of cognitive learning theory provide a framework for learning conditions. Cogne's work in 1985 focuses on intentional or purposeful learning, which is the type of learning programs he believed that events is the environment influence the learning process. His theory identifies that are learned. These capabilities are the behavioral changes or learning outcomes in a learner that a learning theory must explain. Once the learning outcomes are identified, an analysis of the condition that govern learning and remembering can occur, or Cogne's in 1985, page 15. For example, a learner who is participating in a situation where the right condition for learning are invoked, then he or she will experience the 5 categories of learning outcomes that include the human capabilities of intellectual skills, verbal information, cognitive strategies, motor skills, and attitudes. Cognition also relates learning outcomes to the event's instruction. He provides systematic statements of theory to describe the way that instructional events are designed for each of the learning outcomes or capabilities. Cognition in 1985 developed his 5 categories of learning outcomes based on the characteristics of the content that a learner must learn. His outcomes do not consist of any particular order or complexity of levels, other than the subcategory within the intellectual skills category. Cognition separated Bloom's knowledge class into a category he named verbal information, and he added another category of learning outcomes he named cognitive strategies. He believed cognitive strategies were learning strategies that learners adopted and apply in a process of learning, and that they are not subject-specific or Weiger-ND. Description of Cognitive condition of learning theory. Cognitive condition of learning theory draws upon general concepts from various learning theories in order to define what learning is. The theory looks at the observable changes in human behavior that confirm that learning has occurred. Cognitive theory provides a description of the condition under which learning occurs, and by referring to experimental studies in learning. Cognition in 1985 postulates that proof of learning shows by difference in a learner's performance before and after participating in a learning situation. He claims that a presence of the performance does not make it possible to conclude the learning has occurred, but instead it is necessary to show that this has been change in performance. In other words, the capabilities for exhibiting the performance before learning require consideration as well as the capability that exists after learning. The following 4 elements provide the framework for cognitive condition of learning theory: condition of learning, association learning, the 5 categories of learning outcomes, the 9 events instruction. Condition of learning. Cognition in 1985 described 2 different types of conditions that exist in learning: internal and external. Capabilities that already exist in a learner before any new learning begins make up the internal condition necessary for learning. The internal conditions are transformed during the learning process. External conditions include different stimulus that exist outside the learner, such as the environment, the teacher, and the learning situation. This means that each new learning situation begins from a different point of prior learning and will consist of different external situation, depending on the learner and on the environment. Therefore, the useful prototypes of learning by association or described next are deleted by internal and external learning conditions.
The association learning. There are three basic prototypes of learning that demonstrate the characteristic of associative learning: classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and verbal association. Gagne adds a point that relates to the three prototypes. Chaining, classical conditioning, is the process where the learners associate our already available response with a new stimulus or signal. Operant conditioning is the process where the learner is instrumental and thereby leads to a sequent reinforcing event. Verbal association occurs when the learner verbal responses to stimuli that the words or pair of words. Chaining is the process where a learner connects individual associations in sequence. For example, a learner can recite verbal sequences consisting of lists of words or the alphabet from A to Z. Gagne's 1985 believes these four prototypes of associative learning are components of learned in human capabilities and linked together as the basic forms of learning. Gagne's refers picture of how these prototypes of learning relates to the five categories of learning outcomes. The five categories of learning outcomes. One of the themes of Gagne's theory is distinguishing the types of outcomes that learning has. The categories of learned capabilities observed as human performances that have common characteristics. Gagne describes five categories of human performance established by learning: intellectual skills, knowing how or having procedural knowledge; verbal information, being able to state ideas, knowing that or having declarative knowledge; cognitive strategies, having certain techniques of thinking, way of analyzing problems, and having approaches to solving problems; motor skills, executing movements in a number of organized motor acts such as playing sport or driving a car; attitudes, mental states that influence the choices of personal actions. The five categories of learning outcomes provide the foundation for describing how the condition of learning apply to each category. Gagne 1985 postulate that if the five categories of learning outcomes and the way of analyzing learning requirements are combined in a rational and systematic manner, then it will be possible to describe a set of ideas that make up a theory of instruction. He added that a theory of instruction should attempt to relate the internal events of instruction to the outcomes of learning by showing how their events lead to appropriate support of enhancement of internal learning process. The five categories of learning outcomes. In his theory, Gagne's 1985 described five categories of human performance established by learning outcomes: intellectual skills, verbal information, cognitive strategies, motor skills, and attitudes. They will have a characteristic of one or more or another of these categories. Below is a brief summary of each five categories, summarized from Gagne and Driscoll, 1988, Essential of Learning for Instruction. Intellectual skills. Intellectual skills involve the use of the symbols such as a number and B language to interact with the environment. They involve knowing how to do something rather than knowing that about something. Intellectual skills require an ability to carry out actions. Often they require the interaction with the environment through symbols such as a letter. number, or word diagrams. When a learner has learned an intellectual skills, he or she will be able to demonstrate its subject matter learned. Out of the 5 categories, intellectual skills is the only category that is divided into subcategories. The division of is according to the complexity skills require the prior learning or mastery of the simpler skill before the learning process is complete. The links below will take you to a brief summary of a 5 subcategories of intellectual skills: discriminations, concrete concepts, defined concept, rule, higher order rules.
Discrimination. Discrimination is the first skill to master in intellectual skills. It is the ability to distinguish one feature of an object or symbol from another, such as texture, letter, numbers, shapes, and sounds. The human performance of learning outcome achieved by discrimination is the ability to tell the difference among the various stimuli. It is the prerequisite to further learning. Concrete concepts. Concept learning occurs after discrimination learning is complete. Concrete concepts are the simplest of two concept types and consist of classes of objects, features, objects, and events. Some are relational, such up, down, far, near, higher, and lower. The performance or learning outcome achieved from mastery of concrete concept is the ability to identify a class object qualities or relations by pointing out one or more example or instances of the class. Defined concept. Concept not only required identification but also definition. Defined concept required a learner to define both general and relational concept by providing instances for a concept to show its definition. For example, if a learner were to explain the concept alliteration, he or she must define alliteration and then be able to identify the components of alliteration such as consonant sound, beginning, sentence, etc. Then be able to provide a specific example of alliteration. Rules. One concept are learned. The next subcategories of intellectual skills is rules. A rule is learned capability of the learner by making it possible for the learner to do something rather than just stating something. For example, when a learner learns the rule for forming an adverb to modify an adjective, he or she knows that ly must be added to modifier. Because a learner knows the rule to add ly, he or she can apply it to an entire class of words instead of learning an adverbials. Form for every adjective in the language, enabling the learner to respond correctly to words he or she have never been before. Rules make it possible to respond to class of things with a class of performance. High order rules. High order rules are the process of combining rules used in problem solving. When attempting to solve a problem, a learner may put two or more rules together from different content in order to form a high order rule that solves the problem. A higher order rule differs in complexity from the basic rules that composed it. Problem solving using higher order rules occurs in writing paragraphs, speaking of foreign language, using specific principles, and applying laws to situations of social or economic conflict. Cognitive strategies. Cognitive strategies refer to the process that learners guide their learning, remembering, and thinking, where intellectual skills are toward aspect of the different by dealing with numbers, words, and symbols that are external processes. A learner uses cognitive strategies in thinking about what was learned and in solving problems. They are the ways a learner manage the processes of learning, remembering, and thinking. The performance of or learning outcome achieved through cognitive strategies is having the ability to create something new, such as creating an efficient system of cataloging computer disk. Verbal information. Another category of learning outcomes is verbal information. This refers to the organized bodies of knowledge that we acquire. They may be classified as names, facts, principle, and generalization. Verbal information is declarative knowledge or knowing that. The performance or learning outcome achieved through verbal information is the ability of being able to state in a meaningful sentence what was learned. Some examples of required verbal information are the ability to define Piaget's stage of cognitive development, or stating the rules for scoring in a tennis match. Motor skills. Motor skills are the precise, smooth, and accurately timed execution of movements involving the use of one muscle. They are a distinct type of learning outcome and necessary to the understanding of the range of possible human performances. Learning situations that involve motor skill are learning to write, playing a musical instrument, playing sport, and driving car. The timing and smoothness of executing motor skills indicates that these performances have a high degree of internal organization. Attitudes. Another distinct category of learning outcomes is attitude, the internal state that influences the choices of personal actions made by individual towards some class of things, persons, or events. Choice of action, behavior made by the individuals are influenced significantly by attitudes. For example, an attitude towards the disposal of trash will influence how a person disposes of pop cans, food containers, organics, etc. An attitude towards music will influence the choice of music an individual will listen to. General classes of attitudes includes attitudes that affect social interactions, attitudes that consist of positive preference towards certain activities, and attitudes that pertain to citizenship, such as a love of country or showing concern for social needs and goals. For example, choosing swimming over running as a preferred exercise or choosing not to participate in group events reflects how attitude motivates choices.